In the glittering heights of the Grand Meridian Hotel, a lavish rooftop party turns deadly when tycoon Reginald Harcourt collapses, poisoned by a vibrant green cocktail, the Emerald Flame. Amid the jazz and glamour, Miss Jane Marple, a sharpest spinster from St. Mary Mead, untangles a web of greed, ambition, and betrayal. The suspects, a nervous bartender, a grieving hostess, a charming socialite, and a desperate rival. As cyanide tracers and smudged bottles reveal dark secrets, Miss Marple's keen insight exposes the killer in a heart-pounding reenactment, proving no motive can hide from her watchful gaze. Dive into the poisoned cocktail, where elegance masks murder and truth is just a sip away. Chapter 1. The Rooftop Revelry. The August night draped the city in a velvet warmth, and from the rooftop of the Grand Meridian Hotel, the skyline sparkled like a scattering of diamonds against the indigo sky. The air thrummed with the lively strains of a jazz quartet, their notes weaving through the chatter and laughter of the gathered elite. Miss Jane Marple, seated in a cushioned wicker chair at the edge of the terrace, observed the scene with the quiet attentiveness of a woman accustomed to noticing what others overlooked. Her delicate hands rested on her knitting, a soft shawl taking shape beneath her nimble fingers. But her eyes, sharp and bright despite her years, missed nothing. She had come at the insistence of her old friend, Lady Beatrice Worthington, whose invitations to such gatherings were as impossible to decline as they were likely to stir trouble. Beatrice, resplendent in a sapphire gown, flitted among her guests, her laughter bright but tinged with the strain of a hostess determined to outshine her own reputation. The Grand Meridian's rooftop, with its polished marble tiles and twinkling fairy lights, was a stage for her ambition, and tonight's party was a triumph of elegance. Waiters glided through the crowd, offering trays of glistening cocktails, their hues vivid against the soft glow of lanterns. At the center of it all stood Mr. Reginald Harcourt, a broad-shouldered industrialist whose fortune in steel had made him a titan of commerce. His deep voice carried over the music as he raised a glass of the evening's signature drink, the Emerald Flamme concoction of gin, chartreuse, lime, and a whisper of bitters, its vibrant green catching the light like a jewel. To new ventures and old friends, he boomed, his ruddy face alight with confidence. The crowd echoed his toast, glasses clinking in a symphony of privilege. Miss Marple's gaze drifted to those nearest Harcourt. Mrs. Sylvia Langston, a socialite whose beauty was as calculated as her conversation, leaned close to him, her diamond earrings glinting with every tilt of her head. Her scarlet dress clung to her like a second skin, and her laughter was just a touch too bright, as though she were performing for an unseen audience. Across the terrace, near the sleek mahogany bar, Mr. Thomas Reed mixed drinks with the flair of a showman, his quick hands tossing bottles and pouring with precision. The guests applauded his theatrics, but Miss Marple noted the faint tremor in his smile, a hint of nerves beneath his polished exterior. Then there was Mr. Victor Crane, Harcourt's business rival, a lean figure with sharp cheekbones and eyes that seemed to weigh every word spoken. He stood apart, nursing a glass of untouched champagne, his attention fixed on Harcourt with an intensity that bordered on predatory. Miss Marple, who had a knack for sensing discord, felt a prickle of unease. Rivalries, she knew from her quiet life in St. Mary Mead, could simmer beneath the surface until they boiled over into something far uglier. The evening wore on, the air growing heavy with perfume and cigar smoke. Harcourt, now slightly flushed from his third emerald flame, was in the midst of a hearty anecdote when his expression changed. His hand flew to his throat, his eyes widened in shock, and a strangled gasp escaped his lips. The glass slipped from his fingers, shattering on the marble with a sound like a gunshot. He staggered, then crumpled to the ground, his massive frame still in a way that silenced the crowd. A woman screamed. The jazz band faltered, notes trailing off into discord. Beatrice rushed forward, her face pale, calling for a doctor, but Miss Marple, rising calmly from her chair, knew it was too late. The faint, bitter scent of almonds lingered in the air near Harcourt's body, scent she recognized from a long-ago case in her village. Cyanide, swift and merciless. Her knitting lay forgotten on the chair as she stepped closer, her mind already sifting through the faces, the glances, the fleeting moments she had observed. Murder, Miss Marple thought, had made its entrance under the glittering lights of the Grand Meridian's rooftop. And as the crowd parted, their shock giving way to whispers, she knew the puzzle had only just begun. Chapter 2. The scene of the crime, the rooftop of the Grand Meridian Hotel, so recently alive with music and laughter, had transformed into a tableau of shock and suspicion. The fairy lights still twinkled, casting their soft glow over the marble tiles, but the jazz band had fallen silent, their instruments abandoned as the musicians huddled near the bar, whispering. The guests, moments ago toasting new ventures, now stood in clusters, their faces pale, their eyes darting toward the crumpled form of Reginald Harcourt, covered hastily with a tablecloth by a quick-thinking waiter. Miss Jane Marple, her knitting, left behind on the wicker chair, moved closer to the scene, her small figure unassuming yet purposeful. She had seen death before too often, perhaps. For a spinster from St. Mary Medbutt, each encounter sharpened her, resolved to understand the human heart's darker corners. The air carried a chill now, not from the night, but from the realization that murder had slipped among them. The faint bitter scent of almonds lingered near Harcourt's body, a clue so subtle it might have gone unnoticed by less discerning senses. Miss Marple's lips tightened as she recognized it. Cyanide, a poison, as swift as it was cruel. Her eyes, bright and unyielding despite her years, scanned the shattered remnants of the emerald flame cocktail, its vibrant green liquid pooling on the marble-like spilled ink. The broken glass glinted under the lights, its jagged edges catching. Her attention, a single shard, slightly apart from the rest, bore a faint smudge, as though someone had grasped it carelessly. She filed the detail away, knowing that in such matters, the smallest irregularity could unravel the tightest knot. The police arrived with commendable speed, their heavy footsteps echoing up the service stairs. Leading them was Inspector Harold, Grayson, a tall, angular man with a face carved from duty and a manner that suggested he preferred facts to fancies. His grey eyes swept the scene, taking in the covered body, the scattered glass, and the frozen guests. He issued brisk orders to his constables, who began cordoning off the area with tape and ushering the crowd toward the far end of the terrace. Miss Marple, standing just beyond the tape, watched as Grayson knelt beside Harcourt's body, his gloved hands careful not to disturb the evidence. A young constable, notebook in hand, scribbled furiously as Grayson murmured observations. Time of death, approximately 10 minutes ago, Grayson said, his voice clipped. No visible wounds. Likely poison, given the symptoms and that smell. He glanced at the spilled cocktail, his brow furrowing. Get the glass fragments to the lab, and the liquid every drop you can salvage. Miss Marple nodded to herself. The inspector was thorough, which was promising, but thoroughness, she knew, was only half the battle. The other half lay in understanding the people, their secrets, their glances. She stepped forward, her demeanor so mild that Grayson barely registered her approach until she spoke. A dreadful affair. "Inspector," she said softly, her voice carrying the gentle cadence of a country spinster. "Such a lively party, and now this." Grayson straightened, his expression a mix of irritation and curiosity. "Miss Marple, isn't it? Lady Worthington mentioned you. I'd prefer civilians keep their distance, if you don't mind. This is police business." "Of course, Inspector," she replied, her eyes twinkling with a humility that masked her resolve. "I only thought to mention that the St. Almonds, you know, suggests cyanide. A nasty thing, and so quick. It must have been in the drink, don't you think?" Grayson's jaw tightened, but he gave a curt nod. "We're considering all possibilities. Now, if you'll excuse me." He turned back to his work, but Miss Marple lingered, her gaze drifting to the bar where Thomas Reed. The bartender stood wiping his hands on a cloth, his face ashen. She noted the way his eyes flicked toward the police, then away, as though seeking an escape that wasn't there. The inspector began his interviews, calling forward the 4 individuals closest to the crime. Lady Beatrice Worthington, the hostess, was first, her sapphire gown now seeming out of place in the grim atmosphere. She sat on a cushioned bench, her hands clasped tightly, her usual poise fraying at the edges. "I can't believe it," she said, her voice trembling. Reginald was so full of life. Who would do such a thing? Grayson's questions were direct. "You organized the party, Lady Worthington. Did you see anyone near Mr. Harcourt's drink before he collapsed?" Beatrice shook her head, her eyes wide. "No, Inspector. I was mingling, ensuring everyone was enjoying themselves. I saw Reginald take the cocktail from Mr. Reed, the bartender. It was all so normal until—" Her voice broke, and she pressed a handkerchief to her lips. Miss Marple, standing just within earshot, noted Beatrice's distress, but also her careful choice of words. "Normal," she had said, yet parties like this, Miss Marple knew, were rarely as normal as they seemed. She recalled Beatrice's earlier comment about inviting Victor Crane to keep the peace. A hostess who invited rivals to the same table was either naive or calculating, and Beatrice was no fool. Next came Thomas Reed, the bartender, whose wiry frame seemed to shrink under Grayson's scrutiny. His hands, so deft with bottles, now fidgeted with the edge of his apron. "I made the emerald flame myself," he said, his voice steady but strained. "Gin, chartreuse, lime, bitters, same as always. I handed it to Mr. Harcourt directly. No one else touched it." Grayson's eyes narrowed. "You're certain? No one approached the bar while you were mixing?" Reed hesitated, his gaze flickering. To the crowd, it was busy. People were coming and going, but I didn't see anyone tamper with anything. I'd swear to it. Miss Marple tilted her head, her mind catching on Reed's hesitation. A busy bar, she thought, was a perfect stage for sleight of hand. She made a mental note to ask about the bar's setup later, how accessible the bottles were, how many hands might have brushed against them. Sylvia Langston was next, her scarlet dress a stark contrast to the muted tones of the Rooftop. She sat with the grace of a woman accustomed to attention, her smile faint but practiced. "I was talking to Reginald when it happened," she said, her voice smooth. "He was telling me about his new factory. Then he took a sip, and," she shuddered, a gesture that seemed rehearsed, "it was awful. Did you hand him the drink? Grayson asked, his pen poised. No, Sylvia replied quickly. He already had it when I joined him. Thomas gave it to him, I think. Her eyes met Reed's briefly, then slid away. Miss Marple noticed the exchange, brief as it was, and wondered what lay beneath Sylvia's polished exterior. A socialite's. Charm, she knew, could hide ambition as sharp as a blade. Finally, Victor Crane stepped forward, his lean frame rigid, his sharp features set in a mask of calm. I was nowhere near Harcourt when it happened, he said before Grayson could ask. I was by the bar earlier, yes, but I didn't touch his drink. Our rivalry was business, not personal. Grayson raised an eyebrow. Business can get personal. Mr. Crane, word is your company's struggling. Harcourt's death could clear the way for you, couldn't it? Crane's eyes flashed, but his voice remained steady. I don't need to kill to win, Inspector. Harcourt's refusal to merge was a setback, not a death sentence. Miss Marple watched Crane closely, noting the tension in his jaw, the way his fingers curled slightly as he spoke. A man under pressure, she thought, might do desperate things. She recalled a case in St. Mary Mead, a farmer who poisoned a rival's livestock over a land dispute. The motive had been simple, survival. Crane's stakes, she suspected, were no less primal. As Grayson concluded his initial interviews, Miss Marple slipped away from the cordoned area, her steps light but deliberate. She approached the bar, now deserted save for a constable guarding it. The tray of untouched emerald flames caught her eye, their green hue almost luminous in the dim light. She leaned closer, careful not to touch, and noticed a faint residue on the rim of one glass, as though it had been wiped hastily. The chartreuse bottle, prominently displayed, bore a similar smudge on its labeler, details so small it might have been overlooked by anyone but her. She turned to the constable, a young man with earnest eyes. Might I ask, dear, if the bar was accessible before the party began? To staff, perhaps, or early guests? The constable blinked, surprised by her gentle tone. Well, ma'am, the bar was set up this afternoon. Staff had access, and some guests arrived early. I can check with the manager if you like. No need just yet, Miss Marple said, smiling. You're very kind. She stepped back, her mind turning over the possibilities. Cyanide was not a poison one carried casually. It required intent, planning, and opportunity. The bar, with its open bottles and bustling crowd, was a perfect place to introduce it. But who had the moment and the motive? She glanced back at the suspects, now gathered in a tense, not near the terrace railing. Beatrice, her face drawn, was speaking softly to Sylvia, who nodded with practiced sympathy. Reed hovered nearby, his eyes on the police, while Crane stood apart, his gaze fixed on the city below. Each, Miss Marple thought, had a story to tell. And stories, in her experience, were rarely as tidy as they seemed. Inspector Grayson approached her again, his expression less dismissive now. You've a sharp eye, Miss Marple, he said grudgingly. That Omens and two were right. The lab's rushing the analysis, but it's likely cyanide. Any thoughts? Miss Marple folded her hands, her demeanor as unassuming as ever. Only that it's a curious thing, Inspector, how a poison so quick must have been added at the last moment. The emerald flame was Mr. Harcourt's drink, wasn't it? Someone knew he would take it. Grayson nodded, his eyes narrowing. What? Checking the bar stock now. If the poison was in the bottle, it could implicate the bartender. If it was in the glass, it's anyone's guess. Quite so, Miss Marple said. And yet, it's the people we must watch, don't you think? They do tell us so much, if we listen. Grayson grunted, unconvinced but intrigued. He turned back to his team, leaving Miss Marple to her thoughts. She returned to her chair, retrieving her knitting as though it were an anchor in the storm. The needles clicked softly, a rhythm that steadied her mind. She thought of the smudged glass, the chartreuse bottle, the fleeting glances among the suspects. Murder, she knew, was a human act, born of human passions, greed, fear, envy. The trick was to find which passion had burned brightest tonight. As the police continued their work, Miss Marple's eyes lingered on the rooftop, now at Stage 4, a different kind of drama. The city lights stretched out below, indifferent to the tragedy above. She felt a familiar stir, a quiet certainty that the truth, like her knitting, would take shape with patience and care. The puzzle was complex, but Miss Marple had unravelled. Worse, somewhere among the glittering guests and their hidden motives lay the answer, and she would find it one careful stitch at a time. Chapter 3. The Bartender's Tale. The morning after the tragedy at the Grand Meridian Hotel dawned with a heavy stillness, the city's usual clamour muted by a low-hanging mist. Miss Jane Marple, having spent a restless night in her modest room at the hotel, rose early, her mind already threading through the tangled web of the previous evening. She dressed in her customary tweed skirt and cardigan, her appearance as unremarkable as ever, but her thoughts were sharp, piecing together the fragments of what she had seen and heard. The rooftop, now sealed off by the police, lingered in her memory, its glittering facade shattered by murder. She resolved to speak with Thomas Reed, the bartender, whose nervous demeanour had caught her attention amid the chaos. The hotel's dining room, where breakfast was being served, was subdued. The guests' voices hushed as they exchanged whispers about Reginald Harquett's death. Miss Marple declined the offer of a full English breakfast, opting instead for tea and toast, which she took at a small table near a window overlooking the misty street. From there, she could see the comings and goings of the hotel staff, including Reed, who emerged from a service door, his face drawn and his hands stuffed into the pockets of a worn jacket. He glanced about, as though expecting to be watched, then hurried toward the staff quarters. Miss Marple sipped her tea, her eyes narrowing. A man who moved with such unease, she thought, had something on his mind, perhaps guilt, perhaps fear. She finished her meal and made her way to the service area, her steps soft but purposeful. The hotel manager, a fussy man named Mr. Perkins, was reluctant to disturb his staff, but yielded to Miss Marple's gentle insistence, mistaking her for a harmless guest with a penchant for curiosity. "Mr. Reed is in the staff lounge," he said, leading her down a narrow corridor. "But please, don't upset him. He's had a shock." The lounge was a cramped room with peeling wallpaper and a single window that let in a sliver of grey light. Thomas Reed sat at a chipped table, a cigarette burning untouched in an ashtray before him. He looked up as Miss Marple entered, his wiry frame tensing, his dark eyes wary. "Miss Marple, isn't it?" he said, his voice rough. "Lady Worthington's friend. What do you want?" "Only a word, Mr. Reed," she replied, settling into a chair with the ease of someone visiting a neighbour for tea. Her smile was kind, her tone disarming. "Such a dreadful business last night. I thought you might be feeling the weight of it, being so close to the tragedy." Reed's fingers twitched, and he stubbed out the cigarette with more force than necessary. "It's awful, all right. Never seen anything like it. One minute, Mr. Harcourt's laughing, the next, He trailed off, his gaze dropping to the table. Miss Marple nodded sympathetically, her hands folded neatly in her lap. You mixed his drink, didn't you? The Emerald Flame, I believe it was called. A striking name for a striking cocktail. Yes, Reed said, his voice cautious. Gin, chartreuse, lime, bitters. I made it just as I always do. Handed it to him myself. I told the police that. So you did, Miss Marple said, her eyes twinkling with a warmth that belied their sharpness. And you're quite certain no one could have tampered with it? The bar was so busy, wasn't it? All those people milling about, asking for drinks, perhaps distracting you for a moment. Reed's jaw tightened, and he leaned back, crossing his arms. I know my job. I don't get distracted. The bottle was fine. The glass was clean. Poured, I mixed, I served. That's how it works. Miss Marple tilted her head, her expression one of gentle curiosity. Of course, you're very skilled. I saw you last night, tossing those bottles with such flair. Quite the showman. But tell me, Mr. Reed, did anyone linger at the bar longer than usual? Someone who seemed overly interested in your work? Reed hesitated, his eyes flickering to the door as though hoping for an interruption. When none came, he sighed. Mr. Crane was around a lot, kept standing near the bar, watching. Didn't drink much, just held a glass of champagne, barely touched it. Asked me once about the Emerald Flame, what was in it. I thought he was just making conversation. Miss Marple's knitting needles, had they been in her hands, would have paused. As it was, she merely nodded, encouraging him to continue. And what did you tell him? The usual, Reed said, shrugging. Told him it's gin, chartreuse, lime, a dash of bitters. He nodded, like he was thinking it over, then walked off. Didn't think much of it at the time. Most interesting, Miss Marple murmured, her mind turning over this new thread. Victor Crane, the rival, with his sharp eyes and calculated demeanour, had shown an unusual interest in the cocktail that killed Harcourt. In her experience, such curiosity was rarely innocent. She recalled a case in St. Mary Mead, where a assistant had asked too many questions about a neighbour's habits, only to be found pilfering from her pantry. Curiosity, she knew, could mask darker intentions. She leaned forward slightly, her voice soft but probing. And the bottles, Mr. Reed, were they left unattended at any point before the party? In the afternoon, perhaps, when the bar was being set up. Reed's face clouded, and he rubbed the back of his neck. Well, I suppose they could have been. The bar was stocked early, around 3 o'clock. I wasn't there the whole time, had to fetch ice and garnishes from the kitchen. The staff doors locked, but guests were already arriving, some of them poking around. Hotels always busy before a big event. Miss Marple's eyes brightened, though her expression remained placid. An unattended bar, she thought, was an opportunity for mischief. Cyanide, as she had learned from a particularly grim case involving a village chemist, was not difficult to obtain for someone determined enough. A few drops in a bottle, a quick stir, and the deed was done. But Reed's role remained unclear. Was he a careless facilitator, or something more? Did you notice anyone near the bar during that time? She asked, her tone as casual as if she were inquiring about the weather. Perhaps someone who seemed out of place. Reed frowned, his brow creasing as he thought. Can't say, Did there was a lot of coming and going? Mrs. Langston was there early, though, chatting with Lady Worthington. And Mr. Crane arrived before most of the guests, said he wanted to discuss business with Harcourt. I didn't see them at the bar, but well, I wasn't watching every minute. Miss Marple nodded, her mind filing away the names. Sylvia Langston and Victor Crane, both present before the party's chaos, provided cover. And Beatrice, of course, whose role as hostess gave her access to every corner of the event. She thought of a garden party in St. Mary Mead, where a tray of sandwiches had been laced with arsenic because the hostess had left them unattended. Access, she knew, was as dangerous as motive. She rose, smoothing her skirt, and offered Reed a smile. "You've been most helpful, Mr. Reed. It's a terrible thing to be caught up in such an affair, but I'm sure the truth will come out." Reed looked at her, his expression a mix of relief and unease. "I hope so, miss. I just want this over with. I didn't do anything wrong." "Of course," Miss Marple said, her voice soothing, but as she left the lounge, her thoughts were less comforting. Reed's nervousness could be the natural response of an innocent man under scrutiny, or the sign of a secret he was desperate to keep. She recalled the smudged chartreuse bottle she had noticed the previous night, its label slightly askew, as though handled by someone in a hurry. Reed had not mentioned cleaning the bottles, yet the smudge suggested carelessness or intent. As she returned to the dining room, she encountered Inspector Grayson, who was reviewing notes with a constable. He looked up, his grey eyes assessing her with a grudging respect. "Miss Marple," he said, "you've been talking to the bartender, I hear. Find anything useful?" "Only what one expects, Inspector," she replied, her tone mild. "People are often more revealing than they intend. Mr. Reed is a capable young man, but he seems troubled." And he mentioned Mr. Crane's interest in the cocktail recipe. Small thing, perhaps, but worth noting. Grayson's eyebrows rose slightly. "Crane, eh? We're looking into him. His company's in trouble, and Harcourt's death could solve a lot of his problems. But we need evidence, not hunches." "Naturally," Miss Marple said, her smile serene. "Evidence is the foundation, but it's the human heart that points the way. Don't you find, Inspector, that people's actions often betray their thoughts?" Grayson grunted, unconvinced but intrigued. "We'll see. I've got men checking the bar stock now. If the poison was in the bottle, Reed's in the hot seat. If it was the glass, it's anyone's guess." Miss Marple nodded, her mind already weaving the threads together. Reed's account, Crane's curiosity, the unattended barrel were pieces of a puzzle that was far from complete. She thought of the guests' faces last night, their shock and fear mingled with something else, calculation, perhaps, or relief. Murder, she knew, was a selfish act, born of desperation or desire. The question was whose desperation had tipped into poison. As she left the dining room, the mist outside was lifting, revealing the city's sharp edges. Miss Marple felt a familiar stir, a quiet certainty that the truth was there, waiting to be found. She would speak to the others, Beatrice, Sylvia Crane, watch their words, their gestures, their silences. For in those silences, she knew, lay the key to unlocking the mystery of the poisoned cocktail. Chapter 4. The hostesses burdened the Grand Meridian Hotel, though still cloaked in the sombre aftermath of Reginald Harcourt's death, carried on with the quiet dignity of an institution accustomed to weathering scandal. By late morning, the mist had burned away, leaving the city bathed in a pale, unforgiving light that seemed to sharpen every detail. Miss Jane Marple, having returned to her room after her conversation with Thomas Reed, sat by the window with a cup of tea, her mind sifting through the bartender's words, his unease, his mention of Victor Crane's curiosity about the cocktail. and the unattended bar all lingered like threads, waiting to be woven into a pattern. But threads, she knew, needed a frame, and Lady Beatrice Worthington, the hostess of the ill-fated party, was the one who had set the stage. Miss Marple found Beatrice in the hotel's private lounge, a room of plush velvet and polished wood that felt too grand for the occasion. Beatrice sat on a damask sofa, her sapphire gown replaced by a sombre grey dress, her hands clasped tightly around a teacup that had long gone cold. The strain of the previous night was etched into her face, her usual vivacity dimmed by grief and worry. A maid hovered nearby, but Miss Marple dismissed her with a gentle smile, closing the door to ensure privacy. Beatrice looked up, her eyes red-rimmed but grateful. "Jane," she said, her voice soft, "I'm so glad you're here. This is all so dreadful." "Indeed it is, my dear," Miss Marple replied, settling into an armchair with the ease of a trusted confidant. Her tone was warm, her expression one of quiet sympathy, but her eyes missed nothing the tremor in Beatrice's hands, the way her gaze darted to the door as though expecting an intrusion. "You've had a terrible shock. To lose a friend so suddenly and in such a way, it's more than anyone should bear." Beatrice's lips trembled, and she set the teacup down with a clatter. "Reginald was more than a friend, Jane. He was, well, a pillar. His laughter, his energy, it filled a room. I can't believe someone would do this. Poison, they say it's monstrous." Miss Marple nodded, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her demeanor as unassuming as ever. "Monstrous? Yes. And yet it happened under the lights of your splendid party. You planned it so carefully, didn't you? Every detail, every guest. Tell me, Beatrice, why did you invite Mr. Crane? I understand he and Mr. Harcourt were not on the best of terms." Beatrice's fingers tightened on her handkerchief, and she hesitated, as though choosing her words with care. "It was a gesture, Jane. Reginald and Victor were negotiating a merger, something about their companies joining forces. It was tense, I won't deny that. Reginald wanted control, and Victor, well, he's not a man to yield easily. I thought having them both here, in a neutral setting, might smooth things over. I never imagined." Her voice broke, and she pressed the handkerchief to her lips. Miss Marple's eyes softened, but her mind was alert, catching the faint evasion in Beatrice's tone. A hostess who invited rivals to mingle was either optimistic or had an agenda of her own. In St. Mary Mead, she had known a vicar's wife who invited feuding neighbours to tea, hoping to mend fences, only to discover one had slipped a laxative into the other's cup. Motives, she thought, were rarely as simple as they seemed. "A kind thought," she said gently, "but perhaps a risky one. Did you see them together at the party? Arguing, perhaps, or discussing their business?" Beatrice shook her head, her expression earnest. "Not arguing, no. They were civil, at least, in public. I saw Victor near the bar early on, and Reginald was circulating, charming everyone as usual. I was so busy with the guests, Jen and I didn't notice anything amiss until it happened." Her voice faltered, and she looked away, her gaze settling on a vase of lilies as though they held answers. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly, her voice as soft as a whisper. "And Mrs. Langston, she seemed quite taken with Mr. Harcourt, didn't she? I couldn't help but notice her by his side all evening." Beatrice's lips pursed, a flicker of disapproval crossing her face. "Sylvia Langston is always taken with men of influence, Jane. She's ambitious, you know, charming, but calculating. She invested a great deal in Reginald's company, hoping to secure her place in society. I invited her because she's part of that circle, but I didn't. Like how she clung to him. It was unseemly. Miss Marple's knitting needles, had they been in her hands, would have clicked thoughtfully. As it was, she merely nodded, her mind turning over Beatrice's words. Ambition, she knew, could drive people to desperate acts, and Sylvia's proximity to Harcourt at the moment of his death was a detail worth exploring, but Beatrice's own role intrigued her just as much. As hostess, she had controlled the guest list, the setting, the flow of the evening. Had she seen something she wasn't saying? Or was her grief, so palpable, clouding her memory? "Tell me about the bar," Miss Marple said, her tone conversational, as though asking about the weather. It was such a centerpiece, with Mr. Reed's marvelous cocktails. Were you involved in setting it up? Choosing the drinks, perhaps? Beatrice blinked, surprised by the shift in topic. Not directly, no. I left that to the hotel staff. Thomas Mr. Reed's, their best bartender, and he suggested the Emerald Flame as the signature drink. It's popular, striking. I approved. It, of course, but I didn't meddle in the details. I was more concerned with the guest list and the music. Of course, Miss Marple said, her smile serene. You have such a gift for bringing people together. But I wondered, did you notice anyone near the bar before the party began? Guests arriving early, perhaps, or staff moving about? Beatrice frowned, her brow creasing as she thought. It was a busy afternoon. The hotel staff were setting up, and some guests arrived early. Victor, Sylvia, a few others. I saw them in the lobby, but I don't recall anyone lingering at the bar. Why do you ask, Jane? Oh, just a thought, Miss Marple said, waving a hand dismissively. In a village like mine, you know, we notice small things. A stranger near the vicar's garden, a parcel left unattended. It's often the little details that tell the story. Beatrice managed a weak smile, but her eyes were troubled. I wish I'd paid more attention. If I'd seen something, anything, perhaps Reginald would still be alive. Miss Marple reached out, patting her friend's hand. You mustn't blame yourself, my dear. Whoever did this was clever and determined. But the truth has a way of coming out, if one looks closely enough. As she spoke, Miss Marple's mind was elsewhere, piecing together the fragments. Beatrice's grief seemed genuine, but her role as hostess gave her unparalleled access to the evening's arrangements. The bar, the guests, the timing, all had been under her influence, if not her direct control. And yet, her distress, her reluctance to point fingers, suggested she was more victim than villain. Or was she? Miss Marple recalled a case in St. Mary Mead, where a grieving widow had orchestrated a theft to cover her debts, her tears a perfect mask. People she knew could surprise you. She rose, smoothing her skirt. You've been most kind to talk with me, Beatrice. I'll let you rest now, but if anything comes to mind, any small detail, no matter how trivial, do tell me, won't you? Beatrice nodded, her expression weary. I will, Jane. Thank you. You've always had a way of seeing things clearly. Miss Marple left the lounge, her steps slow but deliberate, her mind buzzing with possibilities. Beatrice's account had added new threads to the tapestry. Sylvia's ambition, Crane's tension with Harcourt, the bar's accessibility, the poison, she was certain, had been introduced at the last moment, given cyanide's swift action. But by whom, and why? Beatrice's role as hostess made her a witness to the evening's undercurrents. But Miss Marple wondered if she was holding something back. Perhaps out of loyalty or fear, as she passed through the hotel lobby, she caught sight of Inspector Grayson, who was conferring with a constable near the reception desk. He looked up, his grey eyes meeting hers, and she sensed a grudging curiosity in his gaze. "Miss Marple," he called, striding over. "You've been speaking with Lady Worthington, I presume. Any insights?" "Only the musings of an old woman, Inspector," she replied, her tone light. "Lady Worthington is devastated, naturally. But she mentioned Mr. Crane and Mrs. Langston, and their connections to Mr. Harcourt. It's curious, don't you think, how a party can bring such different motives together?" Grayson's lips twitched, as though suppressing a smile. "Curious? Yes, we're digging into Crane's finances. His company's in deeper trouble than he let on. And Mrs. Langston's investments are tied to Harcourt's success. Motives, as you say, are starting to pile up." "Quite so," Miss Marple said, her eyes twinkling. "And the bar, Inspector. Have your men found anything there?" "We're testing the bottles," Grayson said, his tone guarded. "The chartreuse bottle has a smudge, possibly a fingerprint. We'll know more soon. But if the poison was in the bottle, it points to Reed. If it was the glass, it's anyone's guess." Miss Marple nodded, her mind returning to the smudged bottle she had noticed the previous night. A fingerprint, she thought, could be telling, but it was the human story behind it that mattered. "People are so careless sometimes," she said, softly. "A smudge, a glance, a word to many. It all adds up, doesn't it?" Grayson grunted, unconvinced but intrigued. "We'll see. I've got my hands full with evidence. But if you hear anything, Miss Marple, you'll let me know." "Of course, Inspector," she said, her smile serene. As she walked away, her thoughts were already turning to Sylvia Langston, whose charm and ambition had caught Beatrice's disapproval. The socialite, Miss Marple suspected, would have her own story to tell, one that might shine a light on the shadowed corners of the Grand Meridian's rooftop. The truth, she felt, was beginning to take shape, like a pattern emerging from her knitting, one careful stitch at a time. Chapter 5. The socialite's charm. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the Grand Meridian Hotel's garden, a secluded oasis of manicured hedges and blooming roses tucked behind the towering building. Miss Jane Marple, her tweed skirt slightly out of place amid the city's polished elegance, walked the gravel path with a measured step, her mind still turning over her conversation with Lady Beatrice Worthington. The hostess's grief had been genuine, yet her words hinted at tensions: Victor Crane's rivalry, Thomas Reed's nerves, and Sylvia Langston's calculated charm. It was Sylvia, the dazzling socialite, who now occupied Miss Marple's thoughts. Beatrice's disapproval of her, coupled with her proximity to Reginald Harcourt at the moment of his death, made her a figure worth understanding. Miss Marple found Sylvia in the garden's gazebo, a delicate structure draped with climbing ivy. The socialite sat on a cushioned bench, her scarlet dress exchanged for a tailored cream suit that accentuated her elegance. She was smoking a cigarette, the holder poised between her manicured fingers, her dark eyes scanning a newspaper with an air of studied indifference. As Miss Marple approached, Sylvia looked up, her smile as practiced as a stage actress's, though it faltered slightly at the sight of the unassuming spinster. "Miss Marple, isn't it?" Sylvia said, her voice smooth as silk. "Lady Worthington. Friend, how kind of you to join me. I suppose you're here about poor Reginald." "Indeed, Mrs. Langston," Miss Marple replied, settling onto the bench opposite with a gentle smile. Her tone was warm, almost maternal, but her eyes were sharp, catching the faint tension in Sylvia's posture. It's such a shocking thing. A man struck down in the midst of such a splendid evening. I couldn't help but notice you were quite close to Mr. Harcourt when it happened. Sylvia exhaled a plume of smoke, her smile unwavering but her fingers tightening slightly on the cigarette holder. Yes, it was dreadful. One moment we were chatting about his new factory, the next. She shuddered, a gesture that seemed more theatrical than heartfelt. I've never seen anything so sudden. The police have been asking questions, of course, quite tiresome. Miss Marple nodded, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her demeanour as unthreatening as a village gossip. Tiresome, yes, but necessary, I'm sure. You and Mr. Harcourt seemed to get along so well. Had you known him long? Sylvia's eyes flickered, as though weighing how much to reveal. Not terribly long, she said, her tone light. A few months, perhaps. We met at a charity gala. He was charming, successful, exactly the sort of man one enjoys knowing in this city. We talked business mostly. I'd invested in his company, you see, a promising venture. Most interesting, Miss Marple said, her voice soft but probing. Investing is such a bold step, isn't it? I know so little about such things, living in my quiet village. But I imagine it requires trust and a good deal of ambition. Sylvia's smile tightened, and she tapped ash from her cigarette with a deliberate flick. Ambition, perhaps. I prefer to call it foresight. Reginald's company was set to expand, and I wanted a part of that. It's not uncommon, Miss Marple. Everyone here plays the game. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled, though her expression remained serene. The game, she thought, was a dangerous one, especially when it involved a man like Harcourt, whose wealth and influence drew both allies and enemies. She recalled a case in St. Mary Mead, where a young woman's ambition to marry above her station had led to a forged will and a near-fatal quarrel. Ambition, she knew, could be as sharp as a blade. You were with him when he took the fatal drink, weren't you? Miss Marple asked, her tone as casual as if discussing the weather. The Emerald Flame, such a striking name. Did you see who handed it to him? Sylvia's fingers paused, the cigarette holder hovering mid-air. I didn't hand it to him, if that's what you're implying, she said, her voice cool but edged with defensiveness. Thomas Reed, the bartender, gave it to him. I was just standing nearby, talking. Reginald was in high spirits, toasting to his success. I had no reason to wish him harm. Of course not, Miss Marple said, her smile disarming. I only thought you might have noticed something, being so close. A glance, a movement, small things can mean so much. In my village, you know, we once had a case where a lady saw a stranger adjust a teapot, and it turned out to be quite significant. Sylvia's laugh was light, but it lacked warmth. You're quite the observer, Miss Marple, but I'm afraid I saw nothing out of the ordinary. The bar was crowded, people were coming and going. I was focused on Reginald, not the drink. Miss Marple nodded, her mind catching on Sylvia's quick denial. A woman so attuned to social currents, she thought, would likely notice more than she admitted. Sylvia's investment in Harcourt's company suggested a stake in his success or his failure. If his business faltered, her financial future could be at risk. And yet, her charm, her poise, suggested a woman who knew how to navigate such risks. Miss Marple thought of the smudged chartreuse bottle, the residue on the glass she had noticed the previous night. Had Sylvia's polished fingers brushed against either? Mr. Crane was at the party too, wasn't he? Miss Marple said, shifting the topic gently. I understand he and Mr. Harcourt were rivals. Did you know him well? Sylvia's eyes narrowed slightly, but her smile remained. Victor, well enough. He's ambitious, like me, but colder. He and Reginald were negotiating a merger, but it wasn't going smoothly. Victor was frustrated, I'd say. I saw him near the bar early in the evening, watching everything like a hawk. But that's Victor for you, always calculating. Miss Marple's knitting needles, had they been in her hands, would have clicked thoughtfully. Sylvia's mention of Crane's presence at the bar aligned with Thomas Reed's account, adding another thread to the pattern. Calculating. She murmured, such an interesting word, and Lady Worthington. She spoke so highly of you, but I sensed she wasn't entirely comfortable with your attention to Mr. Harcourt. Sylvia's laugh was sharper this time, tinged with irritation. Beatrice is a dear, but she's old-fashioned. She thinks a woman shouldn't chase success so openly. I make no apologies for wanting more than teas and charities, Miss Marple. Reginald was a means to an end, nothing more. Miss Marple tilted her head, her expression one of gentle curiosity, and yet an end worth pursuing, it seems. You must have been terribly disappointed to lose such an opportunity. Sylvia stubbed out her cigarette, her movements precise. Disappointed, yes, but I'm not one to dwell on losses. There are always other ventures. She rose, smoothing her suit, her smile returning like a curtain drawn across a stage. If you'll excuse me, Miss Marple, I have an appointment. This has been enlightening. Thank you for your time, Mrs. Langston, Miss Marple said, rising as well. You've been most kind to indulge an old woman's questions. As Sylvia walked away, her heels clicking on the gravel, Miss Marple watched her go, her mind buzzing with impressions. Sylvia's charm was a polished weapon, wielded with precision, but her quick denials and guarded glances suggested more beneath. The surface, her investment in Harcourt's company, gave her a motive, however veiled, and her presence near the bar early in the evening, confirmed by both. Reed and Beatrice placed her close to the scene of the crime. Miss Marple thought of a St. Mary Mead widow who had charmed her way into a gentleman's will, only to be caught tampering with his medicine. Charm, she knew, could conceal a multitude of sins. She made her way back to the hotel, pausing in the lobby to observe the comings and goings. Inspector Grayson was there, speaking with a constable about the lab results. He caught her eye and approached, his expression a mix of curiosity and exasperation. Miss Marple, he said, you've been busy, I hear. Talking to Mrs. Langston. Now, only a chat, Inspector, she replied, her tone mild. She's a fascinating woman, so poised. She mentioned Mr. Crane's presence at the bar, and her own investment in Mr. Harcourt's company. Small details, perhaps, but they do add up. Grayson's eyes narrowed. They do. We've confirmed cyanide in the cocktail residue, definitely the cause of death. The chartreuse bottle's clean. But we're still testing the glass fragments. Mrs. Langston's prints are on a few, but so are Reed's and Harcourt's. It's a mess. Miss Marple nodded, her mind returning to the smudged glass she had noticed, the residue that suggested a hasty wipe. A mess, indeed, she said softly. But messes can be tidied, Inspector, if one knows where to look. Mrs. Langston is ambitious, and ambition can make people careless. Grayson grunted, his skepticism tempered by a grudging respect. We'll keep an eye on her, and Craney's not off the hook. His company's debts are piling up, and Harcourt's death clears his path. But we need more than motives. Of course, Miss Marple said, her smile serene. Motives are only the beginning. It's the actions, the small, human actions, that tell the story. As Grayson returned to his work, Miss Marple lingered in the lobby, her thoughts turning to Victor Crane. Sylvia's description of him as calculating, combined with Reed's account of his curiosity, painted a picture of a man under pressure. The bar, the glass, the poison all pointed to a moment of opportunity, but whose hand had seized it? The truth, she felt, was close, like a shadow moving just out of sight. She would speak to Crane next, and watch his eyes, his hands, his silences. For in those silences, she knew, the truth often hid, waiting for a patient observer to draw it into the light. Chapter 6. The Rival's Shadow. The late afternoon light filtered through the Grand Meridian Hotel's lobby, casting intricate patterns on the marble floor as Miss Jane Marple made her way toward the elevators. Her conversation with Sylvia Langston had left her with a vivid impression of the socialite's polished charm, but also a sense of something guarded, as though Sylvia's words were a carefully curated performance. The threads of the mystery, Thomas Reed's nervousness, Beatrice Worthington's guarded grief, Sylvia's ambition were beginning to form a pattern. But it was Victor Crane, Reginald Harcourt's business rival, who now drew Miss Marple's attention. His presence at the bar, noted by both Reed and Sylvia, and his strained civility with Harcourt suggested a man whose motives might run deeper than professional rivalry. Miss Marple found Crane in the hotel's smoking room, a dimly lit space of leather armchairs and heavy curtains that smelled faintly of cigars and old money. He stood by a window, his lean frame silhouetted against the fading light, a glass of untouched whiskey in his hand, his sharp features accentuated by high cheekbones and a tightly set jaw gave him the look of a man perpetually on edge. As Miss Marple entered, he turned, his dark eyes assessing her with a flicker of surprise, quickly masked by a polite nod. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice cool but measured, "I've heard of you, Lady Worthington's friend. I suppose you're here to ask about last night." "Indeed, Mr. Crane," Miss Marple replied, settling into an armchair with her usual unassuming grace. Her tone was gentle, almost deferential, but her eyes were sharp, catching the slight tension in his posture. "It's such a tragic affair, and so unexpected. I understand you and Mr. Harcourt were business associates, of a sort. It must be a great shock." Crane's lips twitched, a gesture that might have been a smile but held no warmth. "A shock, yes. But let's not pretend it was a love affair between us. Reginald and I were competitors, Miss Marple. Our negotiations were contentious. Still, I didn't wish him dead." Miss Marple tilted her head, her expression one of quiet curiosity. "Of course not. Business rivalries are one thing, but murder is quite another. Yet I couldn't help but hear you were near the bar before the tragedy," Mr. Reed mentioned. "You asked about the Emerald Flame. Such an unusual drink, don't you think?" Crane's fingers tightened briefly around his glass, though his face remained impassive. "I was at the bar, yes. I'm not much for cocktails, but I was curious about the fuss. Reed was putting on a show, tossing bottles like a juggler. I asked what was in the drink. Gin, chartreuse, something else. It was idle talk, nothing more." "Idle talk is often the most revealing," Miss Marple said, her voice soft but probing. "In my village, St. Mary Mead, people chat about the weather or the price of eggs, and yet, somehow, their true thoughts slip out. You and Mr. Harcourt were discussing a merger, weren't you? That must have been quite a delicate matter." Crane set his glass down on a side table, his movements deliberate. Delicate is one word for it. Reginald wanted to swallow my company whole, and I wasn't keen to let him. His terms were predatory, Miss Marple. If I'd agreed, I'd have been left with nothing but a title and a desk. But that's business, not murder. Miss Marple nodded, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her eyes never leaving his face. She recalled a case in St. Mary Mead, where a farmer had sabotaged a rival's crops over a disputed contract, his calm denials unraveling under the weight of small inconsistencies. Crane's composure was impressive, but his eyes, she noted, held a flicker of something anger, perhaps, or fear. And yet, she said gently, a man in your position, with so much at stake, might feel pressed. I understand your company has been facing difficulties. Crane's jaw tightened, and for a moment his guard slipped, revealing a flash of irritation. You've been talking to the police, I see. Yes, my company's had a rough year. Bad investments, a few lost contracts. Harcourt's refusal to compromise didn't help. But I don't solve my problems with poison, Miss Marple. I'm not that kind of man. Of course, she said, her smile serene. But it's curious, isn't it, how you were seen near the bar just before Mr. Harcourt took his fatal drink. A waiter mentioned you brushed against a glass perhaps by accident. But it's the sort of thing that catches one's eye. Crane's eyes narrowed, and he leaned forward slightly, his voice low. You're fishing, Miss Marple. The waiter's mistaken. I was at the bar, yes, but I didn't touch any glasses. I had my champagne, and I kept to myself. If you're looking for a culprit, try Reed. He poured the drink. Or Mrs. Langston, who was practically draped over Harcourt all night. Miss Marple's knitting needles, had they been in her hands, would have paused. Crane's quick deflection. To Reed, and Sylvia was telling, a sign of a man eager to shift suspicion. She thought of the smudged chartreuse bottle, the residue on the glass she had noticed on the rooftop. A man who knew the cocktail's recipe, as Crane did, could have planned a precise strike. Mrs. Langston did seem fond of Mr. Harcourt, she said, her tone conversational. And Mr. Reed was so busy, wasn't he? It must have been a chaotic evening at the bar. Chaotic enough, Crane said, leaning back, his composure returning. People were crowding around, shouting orders. Reed could barely keep up. Anyone could have slipped something into a drink in that mess. Miss Marple nodded, her mind filing away his words. The chaos of the bar, she thought, was indeed a perfect cover for murder, but it required opportunity and intent. Crane's knowledge of the Emerald Flame's ingredients, combined with his presence at the bar, made him a compelling figure in the puzzle. Yet his insistence on his innocence, his quickness to point to others, suggested either truth or a well-practiced lie. You speak with Mr. Harcourt that evening? She asked, her voice as gentle as a breeze. A word about the merger, perhaps, or something more personal. Crane hesitated, his fingers drumming lightly on the arm of his chair. We exchanged words, nothing significant. He was gloating. About his latest deal, as usual. I congratulated him, kept it civil. That was it. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled, though her expression remained placid. Civility, she knew, could mask a multitude of resentments. She recalled a St. Mary Mead shopkeeper who smiled at a rival while plotting to undercut his prices. Crane's restraint, his careful choice of words, suggested a man accustomed to control, but control under pressure could crack. You're very composed, Mr. Crane, she said softly. It's admirable in such trying circumstances. Crane's lips curved into a thin smile. I've learned to keep my head, Miss Marple. Business teaches you that, if nothing else. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have matters to attend to." He rose, offering a curt nod, and left the smoking room, his footsteps echoing on the polished floor. Miss Marple watched him go, her mind buzzing with impressions. Crane's cold demeanor, his quick deflections, and his admitted financial strain painted a picture of a man with both motive and opportunity. Yet his denials were firm, and his knowledge of the bar's chaos suggested he understood how easily blame could be spread. She made her way to the lobby, where she encountered Inspector Grayson, who was reviewing a stack of reports with a constable. He looked up, his grey eyes meeting hers, a hint of exasperation in his expression. "Miss Marple," he said, "I hear you've been chatting with Crane. Any revelations?" "Only the usual, Inspector," she replied, her tone mild. "He's a man under pressure, and pressure can make people act in curious ways. He was near the bar, you know, and he knew the cocktail's recipe. Small things, perhaps, but they do mount up." Grayson nodded, his expression grudgingly attentive. "We're looking at him closely. His companies on the brink Harcourt's death could save him millions. But we've got no hard evidence yet. The glass fragments are a dead end, so many prints, including Crane's, Reed's, and Mrs. Langston's. The chartreuse bottle's clean, but we're testing the bitters now." Miss Marple's eyes brightened, though her smile remained serene. "The bitters, Inspector. That's most interesting. A small ingredient, easily overlooked, but so potent in a drink like the Emerald Flame." Grayson grunted, unconvinced, but intrigued. "We'll see. If you hear anything else, Miss Marple, you'll pass it along." "Of course," she said, her voice soft. As she left the lobby, her thoughts turned to the bar, the chaos Crane had described, the smudged bottle and glass. The poison, she was certain, had been introduced at the last moment, requiring a steady hand and a clear plan. Crane's calculated nature made him a strong candidate, but Sylvia's ambition and Reed's nerves could not be dismissed. The truth, she felt, was like a shadow moving closer, its shape growing clearer with each conversation. She would return to the rooftop, examine the bar once more, and let the small human details guide her to the heart of the mystery. Chapter 7. A clue in the glass. The evening shadows lengthened across the Grand Meridian Hotel, casting the rooftop terrace in a somber glow as Miss Jane Marple returned to the scene of Reginald Harcourt's murder. The police tape still cordoned off the area, but Inspector Grayson, perhaps sensing her quiet persistence, had granted her permission to observe while his team concluded their work. The fairy lights, now unlit, hung limply above the marble tiles, and the bar, once the heart of the party's revelry, stood silent, its bottles and glasses untouched since the tragedy. Miss Marple's tweed-clad figure moved with deliberate care, her eyes sharp despite the fading light, as she retraced the steps of that fatal night. Her conversations with Thomas Reed, Lady Beatrice Worthington, Sylvia Langston, and Victor Crane had woven a complex tapestry of motives, ambition, rivalry, desperation, but the threads remained loose, lacking the one detail that would tie them together. The poison, cyanide, had been confirmed in the spilled remnants of Harcourt's Emerald Flame cocktail, its almond-like scent a grim signature. But how it had been introduced, and by whose hand, remained elusive. Miss Marple's mind returned to the smudged chartreuse bottle and the residue on the shattered glass she had noticed that first night. Small things, she knew, often held the key to great truths, as they had in St. Mary Mead when a misplaced hairpin revealed the thief's identity. She approached the bar, where a young constable stood guard, his face earnest but weary. "Good evening." "My dear," Miss Marple said, her voice as gentle as a village gossip's. "I wonder if I might take a closer look at the bar." Inspector Grayson was kind enough to allow it. The constable hesitated, then nodded, stepping aside. "Just don't touch anything, ma'am. The lab's still analyzing the bottles." "Of course," Miss Marple replied, her smile disarming. She leaned forward, her eyes scanning the array of bottles: gin, chartreuse, lime juice, bitters, all neatly arranged, though some bore the faint marks of police handling. The chartreuse bottle, its vivid green liquid catching the last of the daylight, drew her attention once more. The smudge on its label, which she had noted the night of the murder, was still visible, a faint blur that suggested a careless or hurried touch. She peered closer, careful not to disturb it, and noticed a second mark, almost imperceptible. Near the bottle's neck, a trace of powder, perhaps, or a residue the police had overlooked. Miss Marple straightened, her mind racing. Cyanide, she recalled from a long-ago conversation with a village chemist, could be introduced in liquid form or as a powder, dissolving quickly in alcohol. The chartreuse, with its strong flavor, would mask any trace of bitterness. But the bottle itself, Grayson had said, was clean of poison. The glass, then, she turned her attention to the tray of untouched emerald flames, their vibrant hue dimmed by dust. One glass, slightly apart, bore a faint smudge on its rim, as though someone had wiped it hastily. She made a mental note to mention it to Grayson, though she suspected his team had already catalogued it, as she stood by the bar. A memory surfaced from St. Mary Meader case, where a poisoned cake had been traced to a tampered icing bag, overlooked, because it was a common tool. The bar, she thought, was much the same a place of routine, where a single act of malice could go unnoticed. She turned to the constable, her tone conversational. "Tell me, dear, were the bottles here all day before the party, or were they brought up just before?" The constable scratched his head, glancing at the bar. "The manager said they were stocked in the afternoon, ma'am. Around 2 o'clock, I think. The staff had access, and some guests were wandering about early. We're still checking who was where." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes twinkling with quiet satisfaction. An afternoon window, when the rooftop was quiet and the bar unattended, offered ample opportunity for tampering. But the cyanide's rapid effect meant it was likely added closer to the moment Harcourt drank, perhaps during the party's chaos. She thought of Victor Crane's presence at the bar, Sylvia Langston's early arrival, and Thomas Reed's nervous demeanour. Beatrice, too, as hostess, could have moved freely without suspicion. The puzzle was intricate, but Miss Marple felt the truth drawing nearer, like a shape emerging from mist. She left the rooftop and sought out the hotel's chemist, a bespoke man named Mr. Carver, who worked in a small laboratory tucked in the basement. He was analyzing samples for the police, his desk cluttered with vials and notebooks. Miss Marple knocked softly, her demeanour as unassuming as ever. "Mr. Carver, I hope I'm not intruding," she said, her voice warm. "I'm Miss Marple, a friend of Lady Worthington's. I wondered if you might help with a question about the dreadful business upstairs." Carver looked up, adjusting his glasses. "Not at all, Miss Marple. The police have me testing everything: bottles, glasses, even the bar rags." "What's your question?" "It's about cyanide," she said, her tone almost apologetic. "Such a nasty thing. I understand it acts quickly, but could it be added to a drink without being noticed? In a bottle, perhaps, or a glass?" Carver nodded, warming to the topic. "Oh, yes. Cyanide dissolves easily in alcohol, especially something strong like chartreuse. A few drops, or even a powder, could be added to a bottle or a glass, and the taste would be masked by the drink's flavors. It's deadly in small doses. Harcourt would have been gone in minutes. And would it leave any trace? Miss Marple asked, her eyes bright with interest. A residue, perhaps, on a bottle or glass. Possibly, Carver said, frowning. If it was handled sloppily, you might see a faint powder or smudge. The police found nothing in the chartreuse bottle, but they're still testing the bitters and the glass fragments. Why do you ask? Oh, just an old woman's curiosity, Miss Marple said, smiling. In my village, we once had a case where a smudge on a jam jar led to quite a discovery. Thank you, Mr. Carver. You've been most helpful. As she left the laboratory, her mind was alight with possibilities. The smudge on the chartreuse bottle, the residue on the glass. The afternoon window of opportunity all pointed to a deliberate act, planned with care but executed with a hint of carelessness. She thought of her suspects: Reed, with his access to the bar; Sylvia, with her ambition and early presence; Crane, with his motive and knowledge of the cocktail; Beatrice, whose role as hostess gave her freedom to move unnoticed. Each could have acted, but the smudge, the residue, suggested a moment of hasty human flaw that Miss Marple knew well. She found Inspector Grayson in the hotel lobby, poring over a report with his usual intensity. He looked up as she approached, his grey eyes narrowing. "Miss Marple," he said, "you've been poking around again, I hear. The constable said you were at the bar." "Only observing, Inspector," she replied, her tone mild. "I noticed a smudge on the chartreuse bottle and a residue on one of the glasses. Small things, but they do catch the eye. Have your tests found anything new?" Grayson's expression softened, a grudging respect in his gaze. "You don't miss much, do you? The bitters bottle has a trace of cyanide faint, but there. It's possible the poison was added to it before the drink was mixed. That points to Reed, or someone who got to the bottle early. We're rechecking fingerprints now." Miss Marple's eyes brightened, though her smile remained serene. The bitters, how interesting. Such a small ingredient, yet so potent. And the bar was unattended in the afternoon, wasn't it? Anyone could have slipped in. Grayson nodded, his jaw tight. "We're looking into that. Crane was here early, so was Mrs. Langston. Lady Worthington was overseeing setup, and Reed was in and out. Too many hands, not enough eyes." "Quite so," Miss Marple said softly. "But hands leave traces, Inspector, and people leave stories. A smudge, a residue, a moment of carelessness. It all tells us something, doesn't it?" Grayson grunted, unconvinced but intrigued. "We'll see. If you spot any more smudges, Miss Marple, let me know." "Of course," she said, her voice gentle. As she left the lobby, her thoughts turned to the bitters bottle, its faint trace of cyanide, a new piece in the puzzle. The afternoon window, the bar's chaos, the suspect's movement saw were threads, and the smudge was a knot that might yet unravel them. She would watch, listen, and wait, for Miss Marple knew that the truth, like her knitting, required patience to reveal its pattern. Chapter 8. The motive unraveled. The Grand Meridian Hotel. Though steeped in the quiet tension of an ongoing investigation, carried on with the subdued bustle of a place determined to maintain its dignity. By the following morning, the city's bright sunlight streamed through the tall windows of the hotel's tea room, where Miss Jane Marple sat with a pot of Earl Grey and a plate of scones. her mind weaving together the threads of her inquiries. Her visits to the rooftop, her conversations with Thomas Reed, Lady Beatrice Worthington, Sylvia Langston, and Victor Crane, and her discovery of the cyanide trace in the bitters bottle had brought her closer to the truth, yet the pattern remained incomplete. The smudge on the chartreuse bottle, the residue on the glass, and the suspect's guarded words pointed to a calculated act. But the hand behind it was still a shadow. Miss Marple's thoughts were interrupted by the arrival of Inspector Grayson, who joined her at the table with a weary sigh. His angular face, usually set in lines of stern efficiency, showed signs of strain, as though the weight of the case was pressing harder than he cared to admit. "Miss Marple," he said, accepting a cup of tea with a nod, "you've been busy, haven't you? I hear you've been to the basement, talking to our chemist." "Only satisfying an old woman's curiosity, Inspector," she replied, her tone as gentle as a summer breeze. Her eyes, however, sparkled with the alertness of one accustomed to seeing beyond the surface. "Mr. Carver was most helpful about the cyanide. Such a dreadful poison, so quick. And now you've found it in the bitters bottle. I understand. That's a significant step, isn't it?" Grayson's lips twitched, a grudging acknowledgement of her insight. "Significant, yes, but a headache too. The bitters bottle narrows it down, but it doesn't pin anyone." Reed had access, of course. He mixed the drink. But Crane was at the bar, Langston was poking around early, and Lady Worthington was overseeing everything. Motives are piling up, but evidence is thin. Miss Marple nodded, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her mind turning over the details. Motives are such slippery things, aren't they? Like threads that tangle if you pull too hard. "But tell me, Inspector, have you learned more about Mr. Harcourt's business affairs? I find that money, more than anything, brings out the truth. In people." Grayson leaned back, his grey eyes studying her with a mix of skepticism and respect. "You're sharp, I'll give you that. We've been digging into Harcourt's company. He was a titan, no question, but his success was stepping on toes. Crane's firm, for one, was on the verge of collapse. The merger they were negotiating would have saved Crane, but Harcourt was playing hardball, wanted control, not partnership. If Crane's company went under, he'd lose everything." Miss Marple's eyes brightened, though her expression remained serene. "Everything," she murmured, such a heavy word. "In my village, St. Mary Mead, I once knew a man who risked all he had to save his shop. He made unwise choices, let us say. Desperation can push people to extremes, can't it?" Grayson nodded, sipping his tea. "It can, but Crane's not the only one. Mrs. Langston had a fortune tied up in Harcourt's company stocks investments, the lot. If his business faltered, she'd be ruined. She's got that polished charm, but our sources say she's been scrambling to keep up appearances. Debt collectors have been sniffing around." Miss Marple tilted her head, her mind filing away this new thread. Sylvia's ambition, so evident in her poised demeanour, now took on a sharper edge. A woman facing financial ruin might act to protect her future, especially if she saw Harcourt as her lifeline. She thought of a St. Mary Mead spinster who had forged a will to secure her inheritance, her desperation hidden behind a veneer of respectability. "And Lady Worthington?" she asked softly. "She was so fond of Mr. Harcourt. Did she have any stake in his ventures?" Grayson shook his head. "Not financially, as far as we can tell. She and Harcourt were old friends, went back years. She's shaken, no doubt, but there's no money trail leading to her. Still, She had access to the bar during setup, like the others, and Reedwell, he's the odd one out. No clear motive, but he's nervous as a cat. Keeps saying he didn't see anything, but I don't buy it. He was right there, pouring the drink. Miss Marple's knitting needles, had they been in her hands, would have clicked thoughtfully. Reed's lack of motive intrigued her, for it suggested either innocence or a hidden agenda. His nervousness, his proximity to the fatal cocktail, and his access to the bitters bottle made him a figure worth watching. No motive, she said, her voice soft, but opportunity. The bitters bottle is such a small thing, isn't it? Easily overlooked, yet so potent in that cocktail. Grayson grunted, setting his cup down. Exactly. The lab says the cyanide was concentrated in the bitters enough to kill in seconds. Whoever did it knew the recipe, knew Harcourt would order the emerald flame. That points to someone who planned ahead. Planning, Miss Marple murmured, her eyes distant. It's the planning that tells us so much. In St. Mary Mead, we had a case where a gardener poisoned a rival's roses, all because he'd planned to win a prize. He was so careful, but he left a single leaf out of place. Small things, Inspector, always betray the planner. Grayson's eyebrows rose, and he leaned forward, intrigued despite himself. You think we're missing something small, then? A leaf out of place? Oh, I'm sure you're looking very closely, Miss Marple said, her smile disarming. But I did notice a smudge on the chartreuse bottle, and a residue on one of the glasses. The bitters bottle, too, might have its own secrets. Have you checked for fingerprints there? We're working on it, Grayson said, his tone guarded. The bitters bottle has Prince reeds mostly, but a few others we're identifying. The glass fragments are trickier to many hands touched them during the party. Crane's prints are there, so are Langston's, even Lady Worthington's, from when she sampled a drink earlier. Miss Marple nodded, her mind turning over the possibilities. The bitters bottle, with its trace of cyanide, was the key, but its accessibility complicated the picture. Reed, as the bartender, was the most obvious suspect, yet his lack of motive suggested he was either innocent or hiding something deeper. Crane's financial desperation and knowledge of the cocktail made him a strong candidate, as did Sylvia's precarious investments. Beatrice, with no apparent financial stake, seemed the least likely, yet her role as hostess gave her unmatched opportunity. The smudge, the residue, the fingerprints all were clues, but it was the human stories behind them that would reveal the truth. People are so careless sometimes, Miss Marple said softly, almost to herself. They plan so carefully, but they leave. Traces a glance, a smudge, a word to many. It's the human heart, Inspector, that betrays them. Grayson studied her, his skepticism softening into curiosity. You've got a way of seeing things, Miss Marple. I'll give you that. If you spot any more of those traces, you'll let me know. Of course, she said, her smile serene. I'm only an old woman, Inspector, but I do like to be helpful. As Grayson left to continue his work, Miss Marple lingered in the tea room, her tea cooling as she thought. The bitters bottle was a breakthrough, but it raised new questions. Who had known it would be used in the emerald flame? Who had the chance to tamper with it? Reed's access was undeniable, but Crane's curiosity about the recipe, Sylvia's early presence, and Beatrice's oversight of the event all offered possibilities. The truth, she felt, was like a knot in her knitting tangled, but not impossible. To unravel with patience. She rose, her steps light but purposeful, and decided to revisit the rooftop later, when the police were less busy. The bar, the bottles, the glasses, they held secrets yet to be uncovered. For now, she would watch her suspects, listen to their silences, and let the small human details guide her. In St. Mary Mead, she had learned that the truth often hid in plain sight, waiting for someone to notice the leaf out of place, the smudge on the bottle, the heart that beat too fast. The poisoned cocktail, she was certain, would yield its secrets soon enough. Chapter 9. The trap is set. The Grand Meridian Hotel. Though still cloaked in the sombre aftermath of Reginald Harcourt's murder, seemed to pulse with a quiet anticipation as the investigation reached its third day. Miss Jane Marple, seated in her modest room with a view of the city's restless streets, sipped her morning tea and reflected on the threads she had gathered. Thomas Reed's nervous demeanour, Lady Beatrice Worthington's guarded grief, Sylvia Langston's polished ambition, and Victor Crane's calculated restraint had each added to the tapestry of the case. The discovery of cyanide in the bitters bottle, confirmed by Inspector Grayson, had tightened the focus, but the question of who had placed it there remained unanswered. The smudged chartreuse bottle, the residue on the glass, and the suspects. Overlapping opportunities pointed to a deliberate act, yet the human heart behind it was still obscured. Miss Marple's mind, as sharp as the knitting needles she had left on her bedside table, turned to a strategy she had employed in St. Mary Mead when a case grew stubborn. People, she knew, revealed their truths most clearly under pressure when their carefully crafted facades began to crack. A reenactment of the party's final moments, she thought, might jolt a memory or a mistake from one of the suspects. She sought out Inspector Grayson in the hotel's lobby, where he was reviewing a stack of fingerprint reports with a furrowed brow. "Inspector," she said, her voice as gentle as a village gossip's, "I wonder if I might make a suggestion. It's a small thing, but in my experience, revisiting the scene of a crime can sometimes bring clarity. Perhaps if we gathered the key players, Mr. Reed, Lady Worthington, Mrs. Langston, Mr. Crane, and asked them to reenact their actions from that evening, we might see something new. People do betray themselves, don't they, when they're forced to relive a moment?" Grayson's grey eyes narrowed, his skepticism tempered by a grudging respect for her insights. "A reenactment? It's unorthodox, Miss Marple, but we're hitting walls. The bitters bottles are best lead, but the fingerprints are a mess. Reed's, Crane's, Langston's, even a partial from Lady Worthington. If you think this will shake something loose, I'm willing to try, but I'll handle the questioning." "Of course," Miss Marple replied, her smile serene. "I'm only here to observe, Inspector. It's the small things, gestures, glances that often tell the story." By early evening, the rooftop terrace was prepared, its fairy lights dimmed, and the police tape removed for the occasion. The bar was restocked with non-alcoholic substitutes to mimic the emerald flame's ingredients, a precaution Grayson insisted upon. The suspects, summoned under the guise of assisting the investigation, arrived with varying degrees of reluctance. Thomas Reed, his wiry frame tense, fidgeted with his apron as he took his place behind the bar. Lady Beatrice, her grey dress a stark contrast to her previous sapphire elegance, stood near the railing, her hands clasped tightly. Sylvia Langston, in a tailored emerald dress that echoed the fatal cocktail's hue, exuded her usual poise, though her eyes darted nervously. Victor Crane, his sharp features set in a mask of calm, lingered near the bar, his champagne glass untouched as it had been that night. Grayson addressed the group, his voice firm. "We're here to recreate the moments before Mr. Harcourt's death. Each of you will walk through your actions, Where you stood, what you did, who you spoke to. If you remember anything new, speak up. We're looking for the truth, and someone here knows more than they've said. Miss Marple stood to one side, her small figure blending into the background, her eyes sharp as she watched the scene unfold. Reed began, mixing a mock emerald flame with practiced movements, though his hands trembled slightly as he poured the substitute liquids. I was here, he said, his voice tight. Mr. Harcourt came up, asked for his usual. I mixed it gin, chartreuse, lime, bitters and handed it to him. Mrs. Langston was nearby, talking to him. Sylvia stepped forward, her smile calculated but strained. I was standing here, she said, positioning herself near the bar, her posture mirroring the night of the party. Reginald was telling me about his factory plans. He took the drink from Thomas, toasted, and then she trailed off, her hand fluttering to her throat in a gesture that seemed rehearsed. Beatrice moved next, her steps hesitant as she circled the terrace. I was mingling, she said, her voice soft. I spoke to Reginald earlier, but by then I was over there, near the band, ensuring everything was running smoothly. I didn't see the drink being served. Crane was last, his movements precise as he took his place near the bar. I was here, he said, his voice cool, watching the crowd, mostly. I spoke to Harcourt briefly, earlier in the evening, but I kept my distance when he got his drink. I didn't touch anything. Miss Marple's eyes followed each movement, noting the subtle tells the way Reed's fingers lingered on the bitters bottle. Sylvia's quick glance at Crane, averted gaze, and Crane's hand hovering near the chartreuse bottle, as though drawn to it by habit. It was Crane's gesture that caught her attention most sharply, a flicker of movement that echoed the waiter's account of him brushing a glass that night. She stepped forward, her voice gentle but clear. Mr. Reed, might you check the chartreuse bottle again, just to be sure it's as it was? Reed frowned, but complied, lifting the bottle now filled with a harmless substitute and examining it. His eyes widened slightly. There's a smudge here, he said, pointing to the label. And something else. A faint residue, like powder, near the neck. Grayson moved swiftly, signaling a constable to bag the bottle for retesting. Miss Marple's gaze shifted to Crane, whose face had paled, his sharp features tightening. You were near the bar, Mr. Crane, she said softly, her tone almost apologetic. And you knew the Emerald Flames recipe, didn't you? You asked Mr. Reed about it. It's curious, isn't it, how your hand seems drawn to that bottle even now? Crane's eyes flashed, but he kept his voice steady. I don't know what you're implying, Miss Marple. I was curious about the drink, nothing more. I didn't touch that bottle, or any glass, that night. Miss Marple tilted her head, her expression one of quiet curiosity. Of course, Mr. Crane, but in my village, St. Mary Mead, we once had a case where a man tampered with a jar of preserves, thinking no one would notice. He was so careful, but he left a smudge, just like that one. Small things, you see, always betray the truth. Grayson's eyes narrowed, his attention now fixed on Crane. You were seen near the bar, Crane, and your prints are on the glass. Fragments. Care to explain that? Crane's composure faltered, his fingers curling into fists. I told you, I held a champagne glass. Maybe I brushed against something else, it was crowded. I didn't poison anyone. Miss Marple watched him closely, noting the sweat beating on his brow, the slight tremor in his voice. The reenactment had done its work, stirring the tension she had hoped for. Sylvia's glance at Crane, Reed's hesitation with the bottle. Beatrice's quiet withdrawal were pieces of the puzzle, but Crane's reaction was the most telling. The smudge, the residue, his knowledge of the cocktail, they pointed to a man with both opportunity and motive. Grayson stepped forward, his voice firm. "We're taking that bottle for testing, Crane, and we'll be looking at you closely. If that residue is cyanide, you've got some explaining to do." Miss Marple said nothing, her smile serene as she stepped back, her role as observer complete for now. The trap had been set, and Crane's reaction had tightened the noose. She thought of a St. Mary Mead gardener who had betrayed himself by glancing at a hidden trap during a village inquiry. People, she knew, could not help but reveal their guilt when pressed. The truth was near, and the rooftop, with its silent bar and shadowed corners, had given up another of its secrets. Chapter 10. The Confession. The atmosphere in the Grand Meridian Hotel had grown taut as a drawn bowstring, the weight of the investigation pressing heavily on its elegant halls. By the evening of the third day, the rooftop reenactment had stirred. Ripples of unease among the suspects, and Miss Jane Marple, seated in the hotel's tea room with her customary cup of Earl Grey, felt the threads of the mystery tightening into a discernible pattern. The smudge on the chartreuse bottle, the residue on the glass, the trace of cyanide in the bitters bottle, and Victor Crane's faltering composure during the reenactment all pointed to a truth that was no longer content to hide. Her conversations with Thomas Reed, Lady Beatrice Worthington, Sylvia Langston, and Crane had revealed their motives, nerves, grief, ambition, desperation, but it was Crane's reaction, his sweat-beaded brow and defensive tone, that had sharpened her focus. Inspector Grayson, ever methodical, had taken the chartreuse bottle for retesting after Reed's discovery of the faint, powdery residue. Miss Marple, though not privy to the lab's immediate findings, sensed that the evidence was closing in on Crane. His financial ruin, his rivalry with Reginald Harcourt, his knowledge of the Emerald Flames recipe, and his presence at the bar all wove a net that was difficult to escape. Yet she knew from her St. Mary Mead days that a net, however tight, needed a final tug to secure its catch. People, under pressure, often betrayed themselves, and Miss Marple was determined to provide that pressure. She found Grayson in the hotel's conference room, now a makeshift command center, where he was reviewing lab reports with a constable. His angular face was set in concentration, but he looked up as Miss Marple approached, her tweed-clad figure as unassuming as ever. "Miss Marple," he said, his tone a mix of exasperation and curiosity, "you've got a knack for turning up at the right moment. The lab just confirmed it. The residue on the chartreuse bottle is cyanide, same as the bitters. Someone tampered with both, though the bitters had the lethal dose." Miss Marple's eyes brightened, though her smile remained serene. "Both bottles, Inspector. How very thorough. It suggests someone wanted to be certain, doesn't it? And Mr. Crane was so near the bar, wasn't he, with such an interest in the cocktail's recipe?" Grayson nodded, his jaw tight. "He's our best bet, no question. His prints are on the glass fragments, and he was seen near the bar by Reed and a waiter. His company's debts give him a motive as big as this hotel. But he's sticking to his story, says he didn't touch anything but his champagne." "Of course," Miss Marple said softly, her voice gentle but probing. "People do cling to their stories, don't they? In my village, St. Mary Mead, we once had a man who swore he never touched a stolen purse, but his fingerprints were on the clasp. It's the small things, Inspector, that undo them." Grayson's lips twitched, a grudging acknowledgement of her insight. We're bringing Crane in for questioning now. If you've got any more of those small things up your sleeve, now's the time to share." Miss Marple tilted her head, her expression one of quiet reflection. "Only a thought, Inspector. Mr. Crane's composure is admirable, but it cracked. During the reenactment, his hand lingered near the chartreuse bottle, as though drawn to it. Perhaps if you press him on that moment, and the bitters, he might let something slip." Grayson grunted, rising from his chair. "Worth a try. Care to observe. You've got a way of seeing what I miss." Miss Marple's smile was demure, but her eyes sparkled with purpose. "I'd be delighted, Inspector. An old woman's curiosity, you know, is never quite satisfied." The interrogation took place in a small, windowless room off the hotel's lobby, its stark walls a sharp contrast to the opulence outside. Victor Crane sat at a plain table, his lean frame rigid, his sharp features set in a mask of defiance. Grayson stood opposite, flanked by a constable, while Miss Marple sat quietly in a corner, her presence so unobtrusive that Crane barely glanced her way. Her hands rested in her lap, as though ready to pick up her knitting, but her eyes were fixed on Crane, noting every flicker of expression. Grayson began, his voice firm but measured. "Mr. Crane, we've got cyanide in the bitters bottle and residue on the chartreuse bottle. Your fingerprints are on the glass fragments from Harcourt's drink. You were seen near the bar, and you knew the Emerald Flames recipe. You're in deep, so I suggest you start talking." Crane's eyes narrowed, but his voice remained steady. "I've told you, Inspector, I didn't touch those bottles. I asked Reed about the drink because I was curious, nothing more. My prints are on a glass. Phenai was at the bar. It was crowded. I didn't poison Harcourt." Miss Marple watched closely, noting the slight tremor in Crane's hands, the way his gaze darted to the door. She leaned forward slightly, her voice soft but clear. "Mr. Crane, it's curious, isn't it, how you hovered near the bar that night? Mr. Reed said you asked about the ingredients, and during the reenactment, your hand seemed drawn to the chartreuse bottle, almost as if you knew something about it." Crane's head snapped toward her, his composure cracking like thin ice. "You're twisting things, Miss Marple. I was just standing there. I didn't touch that bottle or the bitters. I had no reason to kill Harcourt." Grayson leaned in, his tone sharp. "No reason. Your company's drowning in debt, Crane. Harcourt's refusal to merge was going to bury you. His death clears the way for you to take over his contracts. That's motive enough for most men." Crane's face paled, and he gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles white. "It wasn't like that. Yes, I needed the merger, but I wasn't desperate enough to murder. I'm not a killer." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled, though her expression remained gentle. "Desperation, Mr. Crane, does strange things to people. In St. Mary Mead, I knew a man who stole from his own brother to save his farm. He swore he'd never do such a thing, but when pressed, he confessed. You were so close to the bar, and you knew exactly what went into that cocktail. The cyanide was in the bitters, but the chartreuse bottle had a trace, perhaps a mistake, a moment of haste." Crane's breath hitched, and for a moment his eyes flickered with something, fear perhaps, or guilt. He opened his mouth to protest, then closed it, his shoulders sagging. The room fell silent, the air thick with tension. Grayson seized the moment, his voice low and relentless. "You knew Harcourt would order the Emerald Flame. You were at the bar, you had the chance. The residue on the chartreuse bottle ties you to it. Stop lying, Crane, and tell us the truth." Crane's composure shattered, his voice breaking as he spoke. "All right, damn it, I did it. I poisoned the bitters. Harcourt was going to ruin me. His terms would have left me with nothing. I couldn't let him win. I slipped cyanide into the bitters bottle before the party, knowing Reed would use it for his drink. The chartreuse was a mistake. I brushed against it, got some powder on it. I didn't mean for it to be so obvious." Miss Marple's heart sank, though her expression remained serene. Greed and desperation, she thought, had undone another soul. She recalled a St. Mary mead merchant who had poisoned a rival's well, driven by fear of losing his trade. Crane's confession, raw and unpolished, bore the same weight of human frailty. Grayson signaled the constable, who stepped forward with handcuffs. "Victor Crane, you're under arrest for the murder of Reginald. Harcourt, you'll come with us." Crane stood, his sharp features now slack with defeat, as the constable led him away. Grayson turned to Miss Marple, his expression a mix of triumph and grudging admiration. "You've got away with people, Miss Marple. That reenactment was your idea, and it broke him." "How did you know?" Miss Marple smiled, her eyes distant. "People, Inspector, are much the same everywhere. They plan carefully, but they leave traces: a smudge, a glance, a moment of weakness." Mr. Crane's heart betrayed him, as it always does. Grayson nodded, his skepticism replaced by respect. "You're a marvel, Miss Marple. I'll need your statement, but for now, I'd say you've earned your tea." As he left to process the arrest, Miss Marple lingered in the room, her thoughts heavy. The truth had been found, but at the cost of a man's ruin. The poisoned cocktail, she mused, was not just a drink, but a mirror, reflecting the desperation that had driven Crane to murder. She would return to St. Mary Mead soon, but for now, the Grand Meridian's shadows held one less secret, thanks to her patient, watchful eyes. Chapter 11. The Aftermath. The Grand Meridian Hotel. Once a glittering stage for Reginald Harcourt's final moments, had settled into an uneasy calm by the morning following Victor Crane's confession. The city's relentless pulse continued. Outside, but within the hotel's opulent walls, a sombre air lingered, as though the very chandeliers mourned the loss of their sparkle. Miss Jane Marple, seated in the hotel's tea room with a fresh pot of Earl Grey, gazed out at the bustling street below, her mind sifting through the resolution of the case. Crane's admission, wrung from him under the pressure of the reenactment and the weight of the evidence, had tied the threads of the mystery into a knot. But Miss Marple knew that even a solved puzzle left ripples in its wake. The tea room was quieter than usual, its usual clatter of teacups and chatter subdued by the scandal that had unfolded. Lady Beatrice Worthington had requested Miss Marple's company, and she arrived shortly after, her grey dress replaced by a soft lavender one that hinted at a tentative return to her vibrant self. Her face, however, still bore the marks of grief. Her eyes shadowed as she settled across from Miss Marple. "Jane," she said, her voice low, "I can't thank you enough. You saw what none of us could. Victor, I never would have believed it." Miss Marple poured a cup of tea for her friend, her movements gentle and precise. "It's a sad business, Beatrice," she replied, her tone as soothing as a village vicar's. "People do such things when they're pushed to the edge. Mr. Crane's desperation was his undoing, but it's a heavy price for all involved." Beatrice nodded, her hands trembling slightly as she took the cup. "I keep thinking I should have seen something, done something. Reginald was my friend, Jane. To think it happened at my party. Her voice broke, and she looked away, her gaze settling on the tea-room's floral centerpiece. Miss Marple's eyes softened, though they remained sharp, catching the flicker of guilt in Beatrice's expression. "You mustn't blame yourself, my dear," she said. "You created a splendid evening, and no one could have foreseen such malice. In my village, St. Mary Mead, we once had a fate where a quarrel turned sour, but no one blamed the organizer. The fault lies with the one who chose poison." Beatrice managed a faint smile, her fingers tightening around her cup. "You're kind, Jane, but I'll never host another party without thinking of this. Have you spoken to the others, Sylvia or Thomas?" Miss Marple tilted her head, her mind revisiting her encounters with the other suspects. "Not since yesterday," she said softly. "But I understand Mrs. Langston has kept to herself, and Mr. Reed is back at his bar, trying to put this behind him." Sylvia Langston, Miss Marple had learnt through a discreet inquiry to a hotel maid, had retreated to her suite after the reenactment, her polished facade shaken by the revelation of Crane's guilt. Her investments in Harcourt's company, now leaderless, were in jeopardy, and whispers in the hotel suggested she was already seeking new alliances to shore up her finances. Miss Marple thought of a St. Mary Mead widow who had scrambled to recover. After a bad investment, her charm a shield against ruin. Sylvia, she suspected, would survive, but her ambitions would bear the scars of this affair. Thomas Reed, meanwhile, had returned to his duties at the bar, his nervous demeanour softened by the knowledge that he was cleared of suspicion. Miss Marple had passed by the rooftop earlier, noting his careful movements as he polished glasses, his hands steadier now. She had stopped to offer a kind word, sensing his relief. "You've been through an ordeal, Mr. Reed," she had said, and he had nodded, his smile tentative but genuine. "I just want to forget it, miss," he had replied. "I didn't see it coming, but I'm glad it's over." Miss Marple had smiled, her mind noting his innocence but also his vulnerability, a man caught in the wrong place, like a villager in St. Mary Mead who had witnessed a theft by chance. Inspector Grayson entered the tea-room, his angular frame cutting through the soft light. He approached their table, his expression a mix of satisfaction and fatigue. "Miss Marple, Lady Worthington," he said, nodding to each. "Crane's been charged, and he's not talking anymore, but his confession holds. The cyanide in the bitters bottle, the residue on the chartreusette all lines up. We found a vial in his room, hidden in a cigar box, empty, but it tested positive for cyanide." Miss Marple's eyes brightened, though her smile remained serene. "A vial, Inspector. How very telling. In St. Mary Mead, we once found a bottle of weed killer in a gardener's shed, and it solved a nasty little mystery. It's the hiding places, isn't it, that reveal so much?" Grayson's lips twitched, a rare hint of amusement breaking through his stern demeanour. "You've got a way of putting it, Miss Marple. That reenactment was the key-or idea, and it broke him. I don't know how you do it, but you see things we miss." "Oh, I'm just an old woman who notices people, Inspector," she said, her voice soft. "They're much the same everywhere, villages or cities. Their hearts give them away if you watch closely." Beatrice looked between them, her expression one of quiet awe. "You've done a great service, Jane. Reginald would be grateful, I'm sure." Miss Marple's heart sank slightly, though her expression remained composed. Gratitude, she thought, was small comfort in the face of loss. She recalled a St. Mary Mead widower who had thanked her for uncovering his wife's killer, yet his eyes had held only sorrow. I only wish it could have been prevented, she said softly, but the truth, at least, brings some peace. Grayson nodded, his gaze steady. We'll wrap things up here soon. Crane's headed for trial, and the hotel can try to move on. If you're ever in the city again, Miss Marple, I'd be glad to have your eyes on a case. Miss Marple smiled, her eyes twinkling. You're very kind, Inspector. But I think my little village will keep me busy enough. There's always a puzzle to solve, even in St. Mary Mead. As Grayson left to finalize his reports, Beatrice reached for Miss Marple's hand, her grip warm but tremulous. You'll stay a bit longer, won't you, Jane? I don't know how I'll face the next party without you. Miss Marple patted her hand, her smile gentle. A few more days, perhaps. But you'll find your strength, Beatrice. You always do. The tea grew quiet as Beatrice excused herself, leaving Miss Marple alone with her thoughts. The case was solved, the poisoner caught, but the ripples remained Beatrice's grief, Sylvia's shaken ambitions, Reed's lingering unease. The Grand Meridian, like St. Mary Mead, was a stage for human passions, and Miss Marple knew that. Such passions, however quieted, would stir again. She sipped her tea, her mind already turning to the train that would carry her home, where new puzzles, no doubt, awaited her patient, watchful eyes. Chapter 12. A quiet reflection. The train to St. Mary Mead rattled gently through the countryside. Its rhythm a soothing counterpoint to the clamour of the city Miss Jane Marple had left behind. Seated by the window in a second-class carriage, her tweed travelling coat neatly folded beside her, she gazed at the rolling fields, their patchwork greens softening under the late afternoon sun of August 4th, 2025. Her knitting lay untouched in her lap, a rare lapse, for her mind was occupied with the events at the Grand Meridian Hotel. The resolution of Reginald Harcourt's murder, with Victor Crane's confession and arrest, had brought clarity to the mystery, but as always, Miss Marple found herself reflecting not just on the crime, but on the human frailties that had woven its threads. The Grand Meridian, with its glittering rooftop and hidden tensions, was a world apart from her quiet village. Yet the passions she had encountered, ambition, desperation, were as familiar as the gossip at St. Mary Mead's post office. Victor Crane, driven to poison by the spectre of financial ruin, was not unlike a St. Mary Mead farmer who had once sabotaged a neighbour's crops to save his land. Lady Beatrice Worthington's grief, Sylvia Langston's calculated charm, Thomas Reed's nervous innocent soul echoed the characters she had known in her village, their stories differing only in scale. People, Miss Marple mused, were much the same everywhere, their hearts laid bare by the choices they made. She sipped from a thermos of tea, thoughtfully packed by the hotel's staff, and considered the case's final pieces. Crane's confession had been the knot that tied the threads together, the cyanide in the bitters bottle, the residue on the chartreuse, the smudged glass all betraying a plan both meticulous and flawed. His moment of haste, leaving traces of poison where none should have been, had been his undoing, much like a St. Mary Mead seamstress who had betrayed her theft with a misplaced thimble. Miss Marple's reenactment, a gentle nudge to stir the truth, had worked as she had hoped, exposing Crane's guilt through his own faltering composure. Yet the victory was bittersweet. Harcourt's death, so sudden and brutal, had left wounds that no confession could heal. Beatrice, though resilient, would carry the shadow of that night in her future gatherings. Sylvia, her ambitions bruised, would no doubt find new paths to power, but her confidence had been shaken. Reed, cleared of suspicion, would polish his glasses with steadier hands, but the memory of serving a poisoned drink would linger. Miss Marple thought of a St. Mary Mead widow whose life had been altered by a single act of malice, her trust in others forever dimmed. Crime, she knew, cast long shadows, even when justice was served. The train slowed as it approached a small station, and Miss Marple's gaze drifted to a cluster of villagers waiting on the platform, their faces alive with the small dramas of daily life. She smiled faintly, her heart warming at the thought of returning to St. Mary Mead, where her cottage awaited with its familiar comforts, her rose garden, her teapot, her knitting. The city, with its grand hotels and tangled motives, had tested her, but it was the simplicity of village life that sharpened her understanding of human nature. She thought of Inspector Grayson, whose grudging respect had warmed into something like admiration by the end. His final words to her, an invitation to assist in future cases, had been kind, but Miss Marple knew her place was among the hedgerows and teacups of St. Mary Mead. The city's puzzles were complex, but the village held its own mysterious petty thefts, whispered scandals, hidden grudges that required her patient eye. She recalled a case involving a poisoned apple pie at the church fete, solved by noticing a single crumb out of place. The Grand Meridian's poisoned cocktail, though grander in scale, was no different in essence as the train pulled into St. Mary Mead's station. Miss Marple gathered her things, her movements as deliberate as ever. The platform was quiet, save for the cheerful greeting of the station master, who tipped his hat as she stepped down. "Welcome back, Miss Marple," he said. "Heard you've been solving mysteries in the city." "Oh, just lending a hand," she replied, her smile serene. "There's always a puzzle to solve, Mr. Jenkins, even here." She walked the familiar path to her cottage, the scent of roses greeting her as she opened the gate. Inside, she lit the kettle and settled into her armchair, her knitting finally in hand. The needles clicked softly, a rhythm as steady as her thoughts. The poisoned cocktail had been a tragedy, but it had reminded her of a truth she had long held, that human nature, with all its flaws and desires, was the true puzzle, one she would never tire of unraveling. As the kettle whistled, Miss Marple set her knitting aside, her mind already turning to the village's small dramas. A neighbour's missing cat, a dispute over a garden fence, a whispered rumour at the Women's Institute teach was a thread, waiting for her patient hands to weave it into clarity. The Grand Meridian was behind her, but St. Mary Mead, with its quiet secrets, was home, and Miss Marple knew that the next mystery was never far away.